Donald Trump's US government has taken a 10% stake in the ownership of Intel, drawing accusations from his libertarian supporters and centrist and centre-right neoliberals that he is actually a wannabe Soviet communist dictator who plans on turning America into a communist economy, a communist state, whereby the whole economy is publicly owned. So this begs the question, is this true? Is Donald Trump, the most famous businessman in the world possibly, planning to turn the US, the capitalist superpower of our time, into a Soviet communist superpower? And that is obviously a bit of a clickbaity intro for myself, but I have argued that capitalism itself is birthing communism necessarily in a historically evolutionary process because of the evolution of technology and production, which demands increasingly a revolutionary transition in the political superstructure of our society into a communist system. So what has Trump and his administration actually done? So they've taken a 10% stake in Intel. Apparently, they are lining up similar deals for Micron and Samsung and TSMC. Samsung is a Korean company and TSMC is based in Taiwan. Trump has accused TSMC of stealing Intel's technology and commercial secrets. So he is claiming that this would actually be a fair deal. The Trump administration has also arranged a golden share in US Steel, which is now owned by Nippon, which is a Japanese company, and 15% of Nvidia's and AMD's Chinese revenues, their income from China, is to be handed over to the US government. Now, obviously, this has drawn not just accusations of some kind of Soviet or socialist policy, but of a fascistic, corporatist approach similar to Mussolini. Mussolini took roughly, according to various estimates, roughly 20% of the Italian economy under public ownership. More importantly, really, the state became very heavily involved in the running of private ownership. So private industry and private property was left to its own devices less and less. There was more intervention from the state directing what they were going to produce in the interest of the nation state, the capitalist nation state. I have a potentially slightly different take. I don't dismiss that conclusion at all. I agree with it, but I think there is potentially more going on in the long run. Intel is strategically vital. It's the only US chip maker that could potentially become a Boeing of the chip industry. The US leads in chip design, but not chip manufacturing. Intel is the only US chip maker with a shot at competing at the high end of the market on the world market. Intel makes the US government's chips. Joe Biden's presidency made the US Intel's number one customer. And although the US government didn't take a stake in Intel with that deal, the US government did set certain performance targets for Intel to raise the quality of its chips to the same level as its competitors in Taiwan and Korea. So the CEO of Intel started making big investments with the aim of making Intel competitive with the world leaders in chip making. But Intel failed. These investments failed. They didn't catch up. And so they didn't unlock the subsidies that were potentially on offer from the US government. In the wake of Intel's cratering profits and the failure of that move, Intel's board got rid of the CEO and replaced him with a cost-cutting CEO who also had personal investments in Chinese chip makers. So at that point, the Trump administration, seeing that Intel was a strategically vital company to US national interests and national security almost had to intervene. Trump's administration said that they made this move so that the public is getting something in return for the subsidies it supplies to Intel and to boost Intel's value on the stock market. And of course, he probably does want to resell the government shares for a profit at some point. But this deal means that Intel gets the subsidies that they failed to unlock from the deal they made with Biden, regardless of its performance. Trump probably plans to pressure Apple and AMD and the likes to buy their stuff from Intel. Foreign firms switching to Intel's factories might see doing so as the best way to avoid Trump's sanctions and tariffs, of course. Maybe he plans to force TSMC and Samsung to hand over their know-how to Intel so that they don't get banned from taking contracts from NVIDIA or from using US and tech manufacturing, which would potentially mean bankruptcy. Wouldn't such a move represent a de facto or proto-merger? Many big corporations start working together on production to lower costs before they actually merge. So, of course, he's also done it for national interests, for national security interests, but also perhaps he is using the state as a vehicle to channel any proceeds from Intel that are handed over to the state into his own business interests, such as fintech companies like Bitcoin, which would therefore represent a centralization of capital, which is characteristic of how the system works generally, because that is one way that capitalists offset falling profitability, and they do that by defeating their competitors, siphoning off value from their competitors, and so on. This whole thing is more evidence that capital is becoming increasingly dependent on the state, on state subsidies, i.e. on the taxpayer, and on state contracts and state facilities. Private R&D in the US is almost totally dependent on state facilities. So yeah, capitalist corporations are increasingly dependent on the state to stave off their own bankruptcy. This is one reason we call it state monopoly capitalism. When the capitalist state starts nationalizing or taking ownership of private enterprise, it raises the question of whether the transition to communism is automatic. This is obviously controversial because the word automatic is usually used to mean something that just happens without anyone having to organize or intervene, whether it's the working class or the communist movement. So anyone like me who states that communism is becoming an economic necessity and is inevitable will get accusations of having a one word that is used in the same refrain is a quietist theory of revolution, of socialist transition, whereby we don't call for the working class to unite and organize into a force for socialism or something along those lines. That's not my argument. My argument is that in its attempts to offset falling profitability, which heads historically ever closer to zero, the capitalist class stimulates independent working class activity and eventually bites off more than it can chew. I'm not saying that the government of the day will just realize and say, okay, capitalism's gone as far as it can go, and we're going to have a vote and we're all going to vote for communism. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that a new movement has to be built for socialism, a movement of socialists, communists, and the working class. However, it's an interesting question because without any intervention from communists, we see these ever greater mergers and acquisitions of private companies. In the US, we've seen half of all Fortune 500 companies disappear in the last 20 odd years or so. The same is true for US banks. The average life expectancy of a publicly listed, not publicly owned US corporation has fallen from around 60 years in the 1960s to under 20 years in the 2010s, so possibly that's even lower today. Capitalist enterprises increasingly merge together in order to offset falling profitability that arises from rising productivity and therefore devaluation of commodities, i.e., less profit per commodity. And so we head ever closer, naturally, towards a final merger, which has to be publicly owned since no exchange of ownership is necessary in a total monopoly. And again, without the intervention of communists, within private enterprises, production is increasingly planned. Examples of this are centralized databases, so that data isn't wastefully duplicated, for example, and so that all areas of the company have the same access to the same data. Then there's digital stock control with real-time feedback. So we have, to some extent, we have auto planning already. This is particularly evident with companies like Amazon and Walmart. Then there's been the elimination of internal markets, whereby there are no departments competing with each other within capitalist private enterprise, which used to be much more common than it is today. So again, I have argued that the present system, state monopoly capitalism, is necessarily evolving historically, therefore automatically to a large extent, from state monopoly capitalism to state monopoly socialism, an economy that is a public monopoly and planned as a whole. Because if you've got state monopoly capitalism that is largely planned, we are evolving towards a fully planned, fully state-owned public economy. Now, Marx regarded the character of matter to be automatic because he thought matter was naturally self-generative and self-creative. All matter is vibrational frequencies. The word automatic means self-action. So when socialists say there's no automatic road to socialism, it takes the self-action of the working class. Well, there you go. So I think we should rethink what the word automatic means to some extent. So what do we mean by that? Matter is part random and part relational. Each movement relates to the previous one and is therefore to some extent limited in its next movement. Marx also saw matter as a fluid kinetic process, not atomistic, and this aligns already under capitalism with the contemporary scientific worldview, with quantum physics and quantum field theory, which states that all matter is ultimately one whole. Think of an unpoppable, iridescent space bubble stretching out over infinity. Modern technology is pushing the scientific worldview ever closer to Marx's holistic, process-oriented, dialectical materialism. So, obviously, I don't think Trump or any other capitalist is going to nationalize the whole economy and declare that the future belongs to communism. And even if he did nationalize a lot of the economy, I think he would be doing so to try and rejuvenate capitalism, basically through creative destruction of unprofitable or overvalued capital to make way for new profitable opportunities, as is the case, however, inadvertently, with capitalist wars. And this was especially the case with the first two world wars. It was the destruction of World War II that ended the Depression, nothing else. However, what I think might happen, or one of the scenarios that I think might play out, is that nationalizations might just become the only way to maintain strategically vital manufacturers and other parts of the economy, while also trying to save the tax base, which again, capital itself is increasingly dependent on. Capital cannot afford for the tax base to collapse. So basically, I'll be keeping a close eye on this, seeing if the US government, whoever's in charge, continues to take more and more of the economy under public ownership, essentially, out of necessity, and possibly leading to the situation where there's just no other option, as we can see in the case of Intel, and maybe perhaps it reaching a point where there's just no turning back, because doing so would just utterly collapse the entire US and therefore world economy. But a capitalist state, of course, by definition, obviously cannot complete the transition to a fully publicly owned economy. If it is the case that the capitalist state starts the process itself of nationalizing a lot of the economy, it will be up to a socialist movement in combination with the working class to take over and complete this historical process.